This episode is being brought to you in part by Veeva Systems. Veeva connects patients, sites, and sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to make clinical trials easier and faster. Obviously, if you haven't been paying attention, I'm a big fan of Veeva's Site Vault. If you haven't checked out the live demo that Veeva did recently, make sure you head over to our website, noteToFilePodcast.com, and check that out. Gives you a great idea of how Veeva's Site Vault works and can make operations more efficient at your site. More than 4,500 sites are already using Site Vault, and over 400 industry sponsors use Veeva clinical applications. In fact, 65% of all global clinical trials run on Veeva. That's an insane amount of site sponsors and trials. The best part is, Site Vault's completely free for sites to use. Please head over to sites.veeva.com today and check them out. This episode is also being brought to you in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site network sponsors, and CROs. Without Real-Time, we would have no idea how much money we're owed by sponsors. Really, if you're a site and you're not using Real-Time, you are missing out. They also have some of the greatest customer service I've ever experienced in this industry. So to get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com. Fill out one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Before we get to this week's guest, I really want to encourage you guys to go check out our recent live streams. We've had some really awesome guests lately. Everyone from Raymond Nomizu of Creo, Bree Burks doing a live demo of Veeva Site Vault. We've got some awesome ones coming up with Rick Greenfield. Dirk Arts from Castor will be on there. Christian Burns, Eligo. So we have some really cool conversations. So make sure you check out note-to-file-podcast.com and subscribe to our YouTube in order to get in on those live streams. Our guest this week is Scott Stout. Scott's been recognized as one of the top healthcare innovators of 2021. While working out as a professional investor in high finance, Scott identified a large gap in the clinical trial marketplace and seized the opportunity to build a team of healthcare, high-tech, and venture capitalists to turn his concept of expanding clinical trials into a reality. Prior to founding MedVector, Scott worked with notable companies such as Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo Private Bank. His entrepreneurial spirit has driven him to help numerous startups develop their market fit, revenue models, capital raises, and go-to-market strategies. I've been working with and talking with Scott for a long time. He's a great guy. I really think their concept for MedVector is something that's uniquely useful, and especially for clinical research sites. So I was really excited to have him on. On a side note, I will be joining him on a DTRA Clubhouse on February 17th. So please make sure and come check that out. This week, we discussed the problem with physician referrals, how more doctors can get involved with clinical research without becoming investigators, and how sites can have a more active role in an ever-evolving decentralized environment. So without further ado, Scott Stout. All right, welcome to the show today, Scott Stout. How's it going, man?
Good. Good to see you, Brad.
Good to see you. Where are you at?
In downtown Los Angeles at the moment from MedVector's headquarters.
Nice. Yeah, we're you probably have better weather than we do in the middle of the country right now, I'm guessing.
It has been raining for like 2 weeks straight, and we've got like one of the first sunny days, and it's fun for a little bit of rain, but in LA, it's like you'd think it's snowing the way that people drive. They're like, it's rain, sky's falling.
Yeah, I forget. I guess I forget you guys aren't used to that. So we had a nice heavy rain this morning, and no big deal.
Yeah, it's rare for us, and it's been pouring like crazy, which we need.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, man. I want to jump right in, like as I usually do. I think it's always interesting to hear kind of people's backgrounds, how they got into the clinical trial space. I know you're maybe a little unique, and from a lot of the people we interview, in that you're not necessarily have this extensive background working in clinical trial space, which I think is really cool. We're starting to see, people from other industries who have different perspectives, which I think is really useful. So if you would, tell us a bit about your background and sort of your clinical trial origin story. What brought you into the space?
So I have been drinking from the fire hose for the last 4+ years. As far as when and how MedVector was created, people look at me now and they say, being an outsider from pharma, how were you able to think so far outside the box to identify this solution? And the answer is pretty interesting. I was never inside the box. So I was outside the box to begin with, which, provided some fresh perspective. So, kind of the way that MedVector came about was I was working in high finance. I was an options strategist for Morgan Stanley and then Wells Fargo Private Bank. And I was part of an ultra high net worth team that worked with very successful companies. And so the way that we ran our business was we were essentially free analysts that tried to understand our clients' businesses as best we could. And then we made introductions, right? And so we were free consultants. And so one of the introductions I was making was a private equity company that buys hospitals. And the other was a data analytics company used for hospital turnarounds. And so this was a no-brainer to introduce these two guys. Randomly, we started talking about clinical trials. And I asked a dumb question that changed my life. So that dumb question was, when we started talking about clinical trials, I asked the private equity company, I said, why aren't you doing clinical trials in your hospital? And he said, well, we recognize that it's profitable, but we don't know what's missing. We don't know what we need. We don't know what's in the pipeline. We don't have any relationships with pharma. We have no idea how to model it. So we don't do it. And so here's the dumb question. And remember, I was the analyst in the room. So this was really dumb coming from me. And I said, well, so why don't you refer your patients to the other hospitals that are doing the clinical research and collect that referral fee? And he looked at me and he said, because I don't want my customers walking into another hospital. I was like, oh, crap. Right. Patients are customers in this world. I forgot about that, as everyone does. We think healthcare, we think about serving the patient, but we don't think about patients as customers. And so it's a difficult ask to get a hospital or a physician or a data set or CVS to refer a patient away from any of those pieces. So backpedaling as quickly as I could, I looked at the private equity guy and I said, well, what if we found a turnkey company that lands their people in your hospital, uses your patients, uses your equipment, does some sort of profit sharing, and then when the study is over, they up and leave? Go find me that. So we went looking for that, and it turns out that didn't exist. And so then, that was kind of the ideation. And then we took it a step further and we asked ourselves, well, why would we need to put boots on the ground at all? Why couldn't we use this new thing called telemedicine? And we scheduled an appointment with one of the leading telemedicine providers, and we asked the question. We said, we'd like an introduction to your clinical trial person. The line got really silent. And he came back and he said, we don't have one. And we've been looking for 2 years. This is a no-brainer opportunity. Somebody should be doing this with research, and nobody is. And mind you, this was before the Science 37s of the world were out. This was before Eligo. This was before, kind of the variations of the model existed. And so essentially, we recognized that we could use telemedicine instead of landing boots on the ground. And then we just had to get through the logistical components and the regulatory components, which we've done. And so essentially, in that meeting, I raised my hand. This is a bold move. I raised my hand. I said, all right, guys, if I do it, do I have the support of everybody in the room? And these are guys that I successfully made a bunch of money for. And so they looked at me and said, well, if you're going to do it, yeah, you're going to do this full time. You're going to leave what you're doing. You're going to do this full time. And I said, guys, maybe you're not paying attention to how big a gap we just identified. And Brad, you get it.
I was going to say, it's, anyone listening or anyone who's, whether you're on the site or not, this is a huge issue, right? And it's actually, I had a conversation just earlier today about, establishing referral networks, challenges that come with that. And that's just, one small piece of it, right? If you're a site, maybe you don't need to have or want to have 50 sites, but you need a strong referral network. And to your point, I can't tell you, people are shocked when I tell them, like, I sat in front of a doctor and I said, hey, send me your patients. And they say, well, what happens if I send them to you and they get better and they don't come back? I lose out there, which maybe there's a lot of people in clinical trials who, have their head buried that they don't realize it's a business and those are their patients, to your point. Not everyone is 100% altruistic. There needs to be something that's a little more incentivizing perhaps to these referring physicians, right?
Yeah, and more than just incentivizing, because that's almost a dirty word when we're talking about, working with physicians.
True.
It's really about aligning the incentives. So now it's not just financial. It's what are the worries, what are the concerns? And so if we can align the incentives of the treating physicians with those investigator teams, well, then we might start to see referrals. And so there's a concept that we've been kind of playing with internally, and it's the concept of being able to prescribe a clinical trial, right? And so right now, treating physicians don't have access to the medicines that are inside these clinical trials. And sometimes you'll talk with them and you'll say, hey, this is the medication that we're working on. It's working really well. Would you like to be an investigator? And they say, no, I'm not interested in being an investigator, but I would love to prescribe it as soon as it comes out. So please keep me in the loop for when it's available, right? And so that opportunity of the physician is obviously interested in looking for ways to provide better or alternative methods of patient care for their patients. Because doctors, doctors get a bad name and we call them greedy and they don't want to lose their patients and things like that. But I disagree. I think doctors genuinely believe that they are the best avenue for their patients. They don't want to lose control of that relationship because they believe genuinely that they are the best resource that the patient has. And I like that. And maybe that's romantic, but I like that view. And so when we approach the treating physicians from that perspective and allow them to recognize that, look, you are their treating physician and you should be able to prescribe this like any other medical alternative without losing your patient.
Yeah. And again, you've hit on, a few really interesting points to unpack. And one is that, again, I've recognized this all throughout. Not every clinic and every physician wants to be a PI or a site, nor are they necessarily appropriate to be, maybe given
most are one and done.
Right. Exactly. Well, and yeah, we could unpack for a long time, why that is, but, and also I think something that I harp on a lot, and anyone who's ever listened to me has probably heard, I still believe that the relationship aspect, whether it be between doctor and patient or coordinator and PI, whoever it is incredibly undervalued. And I think that's really where the leveraging that in a meaningful way is extremely important.
Yep.
And, I want to kind of drill down further into what MedVector does, because I think, right now there's big conversations about decentralization and direct to patient and this sort of moving away from traditional trial structure, which I think makes some sites and maybe some PIs nervous. I also think it's an interesting, like almost a big culture shock in some ways to people who've been doing traditional trials. And for me, and again, with the caveat that I've often been a devil's advocate in some of these DCT companies, but MedVector to me makes the most sense in terms of step right into the middle, right? Where you're still maintaining the relationships, you're still appropriately caring for the patient, but involving them in the community and clinical trial. It ticks so many boxes, it's impossible to ignore. So I guess let's drill down. What is MedVector and how does it work? What's the concept here?
Sure. So let me touch on the DCT concept a little bit first and why it's been so challenging to move forward, in my humble opinion. Okay. So what I see with DCT is when we think about DCT, we think about how do we bring the study to the patient, right? That's DCT in a nutshell. How do we bring the study to the patient? Well, now all of a sudden we've removed the study from the clinical trial site and it's somewhere else, right? And so the real challenge that we have is, and so this isn't the fault of the FDA, but there's a lack of regulatory clarity with what does that mean, right? So because now the study is not at the site, the study is somewhere else, right? So what does that mean for the treating physician? Is this a sub-PI, sub-investigator? Is this a virtual site? And the regulatory language coming back is, well, it depends, right? And that's their favorite thing to say in the entire world. Well, it depends. And so everybody's on, like, it's amazing. The entire industry is on board with decentralized clinical trials, but it is moving so slowly forward because there's that lack of clarity of now what, right? So what about this? So what MedVector does is we actually do the opposite of DCT. So instead of bringing the study to the patient, MedVector brings the participant to the clinical trial site virtually. And so the interesting thing here, right, is because we've brought the patient to the clinical trial site, where's the patient? Well, the patient is at the clinical trial site. They're just there virtually. Where's the study? Oh, the study is still at the clinical trial site. The patient is there virtually. We're not bringing the study somewhere else. And so when you start to think about it in that perspective, it adds a lot of regulatory clarity. And in fact, we've established recently that the FDA does not recognize a difference between a participant who is physically at a clinical trial site versus one who is virtually at a clinical trial site. And this is a huge game change for the entire industry who's misinterpreted that FDA guidance. And so this is a huge, huge opportunity for this industry to begin bringing patients to clinical trial sites virtually. And as you mentioned, there is so many positive that come out of this as far as diversity, engaging treating physicians. And that actually stumbles onto another huge point and perhaps a misstep that the industry has made. So when we start talking about making, DCT, the reason that we're trying to get there is to be more patient-centric, right? So this is a big buzzword in our industry. But I think we've made a misstep and we've confused being patient-centric, which the definition is, how do we make this better for the patient, right? There's lots of avenues of that, but that's the concept. That's the core concept, which everybody's behind. But we're confusing that concept with direct to patient. So when we think about clinical trials and how do we educate patients about clinical studies, patients don't want to be their own advocates. And you touched on this a minute ago, they have a relationship with a treating physician that when they don't feel well, they want to go to the doctor. They want their doctor to diagnose and prescribe so they can feel better. They don't want to understand how the molecule works. They don't want to be sold something from somebody else at CVS that's like, oh, try this. Don't listen to your doctor. They don't do that. They want to listen to their doctor. So the biggest piece that's missing in this puzzle, which Craig Lipset has been saying, he's been a champion of this for the last probably a couple of years, is clinical trials as a care option. So this goes back into the whole concept of being able to prescribe a clinical trial, right? And so engaging these treating physicians is the piece of the puzzle that's missing for being truly patient-centric.
Yeah, well, and again, I think even for us at the site level, and people are wanting to get involved at the site level with decentralized trials, as you touched on, I think the the sort of lack of clarity in the regulatory or the regulations is concerning, and even still causing probably a lot of apprehension in sites. I mean, obviously, I've worked with you guys at MedVector, and I'm very invested and interested in what you guys are doing, and I think there's, as you lay it out, it becomes more clear because essentially you're still generating data at your research site. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, in many ways, to your point, not a lot is changing.
There is zero difference.
Right.
Zero difference between a walk-in participant versus a MedVector participant as far as the source data is concerned.
And that's where I think even for me, some of the biggest gripes I've had about what I'm seeing from clinical trial or DCT offerings is because, you are in a lot of other solutions, you're removing the physician or the patient from the physician in some way. So you're creating additional barriers between them.
Or asking the physician to do something that typically they don't do, right?
Right.
Learn this process so you can help us.
Right. Which becomes, concerning because, at the site level, we are getting beaten up on every little, stray mark on a piece of paper. We're being very, very scrutinized. So some of those things become, scary. What if there's a home health nurse somewhere at someone's home and something goes wrong? Who gets in trouble? Is the PI going to be held responsible for that? I mean, Again, I don't want to get in the weeds, but those are questions that come to my mind when you're thinking about some of these more kind of far out direct to patient, as you point out, the important distinction I think that needs to be made. And I still think there probably still needs to be some maturity in the way we use some of these words. I know they're trying to build dictionaries, out for like the whole DCT space, but I think still, even I oftentimes misconstrue or misinterpret how some of that stuff's being done. But again, I just love that you're addressing it in a way it's not as messy to me as a lot of these other options are. And something else I think is incredibly exciting about it is that this can well be a site solution. It could be a bottom up sort of site solution versus.
And Brad, this could be the solution to the whole problem.
Well, yes.
The whole problem.
As people like me are out there trying to grow networks, make connections in their communities. This again ticks an unbelievable amount of boxes in terms of making that more attractive and easy, which is it's going to make more doctors happy. It's going to reach more patients. It's going to fill up the clinical trials faster. It's going to make sites who use this technology more attractive and more viable than sites who aren't using it. So it's hard to find, it's hard to find really any major negative things to say. But I will ask you this though. I mean, what have you been seeing in terms of adoption, knowing that the whole, cycle is still, again, it's a little slow, to your point?
So there's a couple of things that need to change in the mindset of everyone in this industry, right? And the first is this industry, unlike any industry I've ever studied, right, has been given permission to fail. That's the norm, right? What is it? 90% of clinical trials fail to enroll the, desired number of participants by the deadline. I mean, this is a business model that shouldn't work, right? It's 11% of clinical trial sites never have a single participant. It's like opening a Best Buy and not having anyone ever walk in. It's really, really bad. And so because the industry has been given itself permission to fail, everyone's terrified to step outside the box because I'm allowed to fail inside the box. That's okay. So there's no motivation for anybody to do better, right? And let alone if I step outside the box and fail, then everyone will say, well, I should have just stayed inside the box and failed, right? So there's really no motivation within the industry. And because of that, the industry is entirely self-regulated by fear. And it's fear of the big bad FDA. Meanwhile, the FDA is standing on rooftops shouting, we're looking for solutions. We're on your side. We don't like paper records.
Right.
And yet everyone's still doing paper records, right? And so it's a huge disconnect. And to speak to it, I've had conversations with, very senior people, right? In ClinOps and, at corporate level at sponsors. And they know the gospel of the FDA. I call it the gospel because it's not the law. They've never read the law. They've heard the gospel, right? And this has been passed down from generation to generation, boss to boss, right? Of this is what the FDA likes. And nobody's actually read the guidance. It's crazy. And so people will stand up to us and be like, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, yeah, we can. Here, it's right here in the guidance. They go, no, that's not right.
Yeah, it's shocking to me. I mean, again, at the site, look, I talk to a lot of monitors. Monitors go through our stuff and say, you can't do that. And it's fun to go to the FDA guidance and say, haha, yes, I can. Look at this right here. But it's shocking that stuff can be, I don't want to say 100% clear because there's certainly some vagary at times in some of the FDA guidance. But nonetheless, some of it's pretty damn clear. You can do this and we're okay with that. But yet, for whatever reason, we still self-impose sort of these bizarre extra rules. I mean, why are we doing this?
There's a key term that I've only heard from ex-FDA people. Okay. And I had never heard it from the site level. It's defensible, right? So if you're being audited, if your site's being audited, if you have a defensible position of why you're doing what you did, that's what they're looking for. The confusion is the FDA has not approved that yet. The FDA actually doesn't approve clinical trial. They give guidelines, right? But they don't actually approve it, right? And so, sub-Is and investigators aren't approved by the FDA. They're approved by the sponsor. And hopefully they will be good enough when the FDA makes their decision. But this is a huge piece that's missing is defensible. So as a site, like some of the best advice that I can give is when you're being audited is make sure that you've got the proper SOPs that make your position defensible, right? Understand what it is that's in the FDA guidance so you can point to it, just like you said. But it's the strangest thing. And you see it from one side, but I have the ability to see it from both sides. So I see the relationship that the sponsors and CROs have with, sites like yourself. And I also see the relationships that sites like yourself have with sponsors and CROs. And you're both terrified of each other. The ClinOps people will not introduce anybody to a PI because we're like, oh, we don't want to rock the boat. This guy does good work for us. And the ClinOps, or not the ClinOps teams, but the clinical trial sites themselves are terrified to introduce us to the sponsor. This is the hand that feeds us. We don't want to rock the boat. And so there needs to be a better bridge between between these two avenues. And the bridge actually needs to probably be a higher element of support for clinical trial sites, to where they're not going to the bottom clinical trial ops people who are scared to death to bring anything to their boss, right?
Yeah.
There needs to be a pathway to a higher up corporate person that can then provide a little top-down support to say, you know what, this is interesting. You should keep doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing point. And I think you're right. I feel, and I could be wrong, I feel like for, relatively small site network, there's a lot of people like me, my size, maybe slightly bigger, slightly smaller. I feel like the stakes are very high for us. If we, make Pfizer mad, that could be millions of dollars I may miss out on, which is insignificant for me, as to where Pfizer can go to 1,000 other sites that will do whatever they say. So it does, to your point, create a little bit of let's not step too far outside the box. Let's not go out on a limb too much. But I think, again, the irony is that if we were more confident, then the sites doing that are going to become more attractive, right? And I love your point too, that, for me, it's always been just like you said, be, I guess, defensible, right? So be able to have a narrative of like, look, here's why, referring to the guidance, here's why this is okay, and why we say it's okay, because we're not stupid. We can interpret these things and implement them in the way we see fit.
This is a big thing that we do with our sites that we work with as well, is we help them write those SOPs, and we make sure that they are defensible. While you did say that, MedVector is a site utility, which it is, this is a site decision. This isn't something that needs to be vendor approved. This isn't something that needs to be protocol approved. This is just a site utility. And so having that freedom gives the sites the opportunity to kind of move pharma's hand for them, right? Because it's interesting, because, when we talk to sponsors, initially when we were asking them for permission, they were saying, I don't know. I'm not interested in introducing you to a site. But when we recognized that this was a site utility, and that the sites didn't have to ask, and we can help them create those defensible positions. And not that we're hiding it from anybody, but the sponsor wouldn't even be able to tell the difference in the data, right? Because source data is identical. And so, having that opportunity when we went back to sponsors and saying, we're not asking your permission anymore, but if you run into it, don't freak out. I thought we were going to get crazy pushback, but the opposite happened. Instead, the sponsors went, wait, really? You can do this and I don't have to say yes? All right, this changes things. And it was a game changer for us. And so, I think that pathway, and so finding the sites that are comfortable being defensible and being that kind of front line, we really, like yourself, right? So we really have the opportunity to change medicine as we know it.
Well, and again, I think that's a huge thing that you sort of, glossed over. Having helping provide that SOP, justification, whatever you want to call it, to the sites, I think is a huge step, because again, I think sites tend to get bogged down, again, just like sponsors, right? Like we start second guessing, and we start sort of getting too into the weeds on some of the things, overthinking it to different degrees. So to have that sort of support, is huge. And I know you've got ex-FDA on your team, so you've got people who know what they're talking about. This isn't something that's just being plucked out of the air.
We come in and we certify all the compliance behind all the logistics, and we dive through a protocol, and so the important part about what we're doing is it's not protocol dependent, it's appointment dependent. So there are some appointments you just can't do virtually yet, right? There are some appointments that let's say we're doing an infusion, right? So, and moving an IP like an infusion or a chemotherapy or something like that is very challenging. So that appointment, let's just do it from the clinical trial site and do everything else from the alternate location, which would be the physician practice. By using this alternate location, one of the things we haven't mentioned is we can do this without the treating physician becoming a sub-I or triggering a clinical trial site, which is the cool part, right? So it's a non-auditable location.
Yeah, well, and that's two things again.
Brad, we fixed it. Tell everybody.
Two beautiful things there. One is that, obviously you're not adding more paperwork. You're not adding more burden to the site who's trying to make that stuff happen, which is, again, that's challenging, right? Adding the more people you have to rely on and get involved, I just find that the uglier things can get for you as a site. So, and to not have to do that is obviously a huge advantage. And again, something I think is really kind of overlooked. Again, we're used to being, you'd be shocked by how many people we've been told to put on 1572s who are not appropriate in any way to be put on a 1572, right? So still sort of sometimes living with that can be challenging and dealing with that. Well, and again, you open up your network ridiculously as a site, right? I mean, you become almost unlimited in terms of what your reach can be.
So, Brad, let me ask you the question in front of everyone: is there a local specialist that should be referring patients to your site that isn't?
Yeah, 100%, probably dozens.
Right, and so this is another permission to fail category where ClinOps people are convinced that the clinical trial candidates in a footprint around a clinical trial site are exhausted because they can't find any more. And so they start building other sites. I've had conversations about connecting patients from the outback of Australia. And I look at those people and I say, what's wrong with Chicago? Do we really think that we've exhausted the clinical trial candidate pool in this city already? We haven't. And I know that we haven't because somebody at pharma has done an analysis of whether or not this medication can sell based off of the population and how many people need it. So they're not building a medication that's not for anybody, right? They're building something that has the potential to make them a lot of money. So the patients are there. We're just missing them because we don't have access to them. Yeah.
Well, and again, that's been a complaint from me with some of these, again, DCT solutions. Is I'm like, hey man, look, the patients are here. We don't need to get nuts with it. They're around. We just need a better bridge. The same way you referenced it earlier. They're here. Again, they're more willing than you think they are to be involved in clinical trials. Patients want to be involved, but again, the opportunities are so siloed and tucked away. So this immediately helps solve that issue.
Yeah. So let's talk quickly about dropout rates and diversity. So the industry right now is looking for the largest databases for the most part, when if you want to partner with a physician, for the most part, the industry looks for who has the biggest practice because statistically that'll have the most patients for me, right? Well, I think that that's a mistake also because if you're doing a blood pressure medication, right? Should you talk to a GP or should you talk to a cardiologist? And the interesting thing is the cardiologist doesn't need to do a patient record search. They know off the top of their head who their patients are because they're the ones that have a genuine relationship with their patient. So if all of a sudden your specialist recommends a clinical trial, you're going to take it very seriously. And if you have a relationship with your specialist like I have with my specialist, if I moved to Texas, I would fly back to California to meet with my specialist. My specialist, as far as I'm concerned, saved my life, and he's also one of my investors. That's the relationship that I have with this guy, right?
Right.
If I was participating in a clinical trial with him, do you think I would ever let him down? Never. I would never drop out.
Yeah. It's again, you see it in a site. We see it every single day. The patients who come through a physician are incredibly more likely to be compliant, to remain in the study, to do what's asked of them,
enrollment goes up.
Yeah.
They stay in the study longer.
Yeah, there's literally, again, every upside that you can think of exists versus answering a cold call from an advertisement you put out. Not that can't be successful, but if you're talking just in terms of like what
current patient recruitment is all about who has the best Facebook algorithm, and that's terrifying.
Well, yeah, there's a whole slew of issues, and even as a site, you don't want to be, you can be taking 100 phone calls to get one patient in the door. And that patient may flake after they get their first $50. And, because again, there's nothing anchoring them there, so to speak. Maybe that's not the best word, but you get what I mean. Like there's no existing relationship. It becomes completely transactional.
Yep.
And, on top of that, you may be chasing down medical records for days and weeks and months, not even knowing if the patient fits as to where, if you've got a patient in a practice, you've also got the records right there. So your data immediately becomes more reliable.
And let's not forget the diversity element, right? So if you've got a community physician, and this is somebody that you trust, and it's not random Hightower calling
Right,
you,
right.
right? It's your doctor, right? That looks like you.
Well, again, completely underappreciated, I think, because even with doctors who we have some relationship with, they may send us a referral via, even a text message or an email, or they may give them our number. But ultimately, who the hell is this guy? I'm just some guy. They don't know who I am. Even though their doctor may have brought it up, they're still sort of starting over and building that relationship as to where, what if they were right there in their office with their doctor they already trust?
Mm-hmm.
You've eliminated all the ways things can go wrong. And again,
Yep.
I just can't get over how we oftentimes overlook that relationship. And instead, we're trying to pull people out and have a sort of transactional, great, you're in our study, whatever it takes, but not leveraging existing relationships.
Yep. Brad, you get it. I love that you get it.
Well, again, it makes perfect sense. And again, I can understand this is a tool that certainly has potential beyond, being site driven, but I love that it can be, because a lot can't be. A site can't decide to build an app and try to enroll a patient in New Jersey if I'm in Oklahoma. I really can't do that. It's beyond my scope, but I can use, an existing tool. I can use MedVector along with my own relationships that I already have. And it really puts you in the driver's seat as a site. And again, some SOP support with the knowledge that, this has been vetted by, ex-FDA guys who've written regulations and have written guidances that we're all familiar with. That I think there's a lot of, I don't know, that's very hopeful for me when I see a lot of solutions that I think frankly suck out there. And if anything, some solutions out there are hurting community research, by instead sort of using the hard work of the community-based partners and rolling them up under this big company. And I've seen that. I'm not going to go too deep in that. But again, this gives the site the drivers, really puts them in the driver's seat.
Mm-hmm. It engages that treating physician and that relationship. These physicians, they genuinely want to do better for their patients. And so giving them this opportunity and this, clinical trials as a care option or prescribing a clinical trial, they like it. They like the idea. And I also think, back to the specialist component, I think that specialists are the real target because they genuinely know their patients. They genuinely have that relationship and they know their patients off the top of their head, right? And Brad, you've seen it firsthand, right? So you and I, we went and met with a treating physician, and he liked it so much, he gave you access to his EMR on the drive home.
Yep.
Right? It's unbelievable. Like that's a game changer in itself because he now wanted your help to recruit from his practice because he got to keep the patients. That's the solution.
Well, and again, for us, it was one of those, it's a rural community, but they have a crap load of patients that are sitting there unserved, not even an iota of opportunity to be in a clinical trial.
And he was a specialist.
Exactly.
And he didn't have to do a database search. He told us off the top of his head. He said, "I treat 3 to 4 a day."
Right. Yeah. And again, those are maybe counterintuitively, those are better numbers than what we're seeing in our, more urban big city physician office. So again, I'm really, obviously I don't need to be sold on it, but the more work we do in the space, the more it makes sense and just seems so low-hanging fruit. Again, the adoption should be easy, right? It makes perfect sense.
The adoption, is relatively easy once we get past the conceptual understanding and the concerns of regulatory wise and also fear of the sponsor. So once we get past those at the site level, then implementing it is easy.
Yeah, that's true. That is true, and it's going to take probably going to take a few sites to go out down a limb, show everybody how it's done. We sort of win the spoils, so to speak, and then I think we'll really start to see more widespread adoption. But hey, by then might be too late. It might be those early adopters have already eaten up a bunch of market there, right?
As you know, those early adopters are the ones that are going to survive. And it's not just surviving against your peers because you're recruiting better, right? There's a bigger piece of MedVector that's on the train tracks, right? And it's how do we gain access major healthcare data points, draw candidates from these large healthcare databases like CVS. So CVS is looking for ways to engage their patient population into clinical studies. And right now they're doing pop-up clinical trial sites or brick and mortar that faces the same problem as any other site, right? They just have this large database attached to it, but they're still geographically limited. Well, what if MedVector has the ability to partner with a bunch of major databases and distribute the inclusion-exclusion criteria, allowing them to do their own patient recruitment? When they identify a patient, we introduce them to you, you screen the patient, and then as soon as the appointment is scheduled, we send a MedVector window to wherever that patient may be, whether it's a CVS Minute Clinic or it's a physician location or it's a community center or long-term care facility. I mean, the options are limitless to where the early adopters like yourself are going to get a handful of free recruitment because we're going to have more than we know what to deal with. And you're going to have to buy the building next door.
You're right. It really does become insanely just unlimited in terms of what you can do from there. Because it really when geography stops being an issue, and I don't know, it's exciting, man. I don't even know where to go from there. It's exciting.
Cheers! It's exciting.
Well, Scott, where can people find you online?
We can go to medvector.com. That's MEDVECTOR, MedVector. That's the direction of medicine, which is where that name comes from. I don't even know if you knew that. But medicine and vector, so vector is a direction with both. It's a direction with magnitude, and that's what we're doing. Is we're changing the direction of medicine with some magnitude. So you can go to medvector.com, or you can email me directly, scott.stout@medvector.com. Happy to have a conversation with anybody that wants to push back. I've gotten good at that. And would love to be introduced to, a couple other renegade cool sites like Hightower Clinical.
Yeah, guys, I'll put Scott's info in our show notes. Hit him up. He loves to argue, talk whiskey, all those things. A great guy.
Yeah.
Anything else before we sign off here?
I don't think so. This was good.
Beautiful. Well, I may have, if you're interested, maybe come back and do a live stream, and maybe we can dive down into some of the things, maybe even if you're interested at all, demo or talk a little bit more about some use cases or case studies. I'd love to be able to continue to elaborate on some of this. Because again, this is one of very few solutions that I've really embraced. And, we've done a little bit of work together. Certainly want to do a whole lot more. So I really appreciate you coming on, man.
Yep. Thanks, Brad. You're one of our faves.
Thanks, man. Until next time. As always, thank you so much for listening to Note to File podcast. Do us a favor, make sure you subscribe, review, rate us wherever you listen to the podcast. Make sure and go check out our live streams at notetofilepodcast.com. And also check out the website for episode transcripts, show notes, as well as our guest contact information. Again, guys, thanks so much for listening.